Good evening and welcome, everyone. I want to welcome you to tonight's Venice virtual town hall meeting about SB79. I wanted to acknowledge my colleagues. There's Jeff Cow and William Ayala, and then, of course, Councilwoman Tracy Park. Jeff and I are part of the Councilwoman's Planning and Transportation team, and we often engage with many of you when questions come about for projects. So tonight's meeting is for informational purposes about pending legislation, and I wanted to turn this over to Councilwoman Park to now talk to you about Senate Bill 79.
All right. Thank you so much, Craig and team, for being with us this evening. And thank you to those of you who made time on a Thursday evening to hang out with us to talk about these very, very important issues in our community. I wanted to take some time to make this information session available to you. In large part because Senate Bill 79 is very, very quickly making its way through the state assembly before it will go back to the Senate for a final vote and then to the governor. We expect the legislative process to be wrapped up at some point mid-month. And I just am not certain how closely people have been tracking this particular bill, which actually is going to have very, very significant impacts in several parts of Council District 11, including Venice. For those of you who are here with us tonight, you probably already know that for the last 2.5 years, we as a council office have worked very, very closely with the community in updating our community plans. We have had dozens and dozens of meetings with residents and stakeholders to evaluate the draft maps that were produced by the planning department not long after I took office. We were very, very glad to receive your feedback and your input, and your input as we were focusing on how we can allocate additional housing and new density in Venice as we try to meet our state mandates. Now, we have worked very, very hard on this and done it in a way that has been mindful of our existing single-family neighborhoods, unique traffic and parking challenges that we have here in Venice, as well as issues related to development in the coastal zone. The planning department has been very, very gracious in working with us, and this has been very much a community-led effort to address our housing challenges here in Venice and across the West Side. Many of you are also aware that we recently passed as a council, and with the support of the mayor, following exhaustive community engagement, our citywide housing incentive program, or CHIP, which also works to allocate density primarily around our commercial and transit corridors and centers, but also, again, is mindful of protecting existing communities, the fabric of our neighborhoods, and leaves us some flexibility in being able to put new housing in places where it is appropriate and it makes sense to do that. We as a city have worked very, very hard to create pathways for new housing and to comply with our state mandates. Our housing element of our general plan has been approved by the state. So we have already done a lot of this work through our grassroots efforts. SB 79 is a Sacramento-led statewide effort that would essentially eliminate community voices and local control over the addition of new density around certain transit centers and transit corridors. And I'm going to have Craig walk through in a few minutes some slides to show you what SB 79 does and the areas here in Venice that will be directly and indirectly impacted by it. I want to be very clear that we do need housing in Los Angeles, including on the West Side. We need to build a lot of different types of housing, not just apartments to rent, but also homes that have an opportunity for ownership. And I recognize that this is an urgent goal, and I am very, very glad with the steps that we have taken to achieve this. But I also think it is important that communities have a say. Here in Council District 11, we have some of the most difficult and disaster-prone terrain anywhere in Los Angeles. And that includes neighborhoods around our country's second largest airport, communities in Venice that are 100 years old, that were built in a time of streetcars, not in a day of modern oversized vehicles. I also represent insensitive environmental areas, as well as very high fire severity zones. In many parts of the West Side, we are traffic challenged and parking impacted, and we have very few evacuation routes in certain scenarios. And so I think as a community and as a leader here in our city, as we think about the allocation of density and where and how to put housing, it is really important that we all have a say so that we can do this in a safe and responsible way. After what we just witnessed in the Pacific Palisades in January with the chaotic evacuation, as well as the strains that we saw on our water systems and our electrical grid, I have real concerns about our ability to ensure that our infrastructure is adequately up to par in order to accommodate the new density as well. Whether you own a home, whether you rent a home, whether you live in a single family home, or whether you live in a townhouse, a condo, an apartment, or something else, many of these state mandates and SB79 in particular are going to have a potential impact in your community. And these will be by right projects. These are things that will not come to me or to the city council for a vote. I think it is also really important that as we think about how we are going to implement additional housing and density, we are focusing on public safety and smart planning, and not being given mandates from bureaucrats in Sacramento who have most likely never even visited our neighborhoods. And so I have some concerns about it. I know you all are here because you care about these issues. I know many of us have worked very, very hard these last 2.5 years to try to get this right. And so I wanted to take the opportunity to have Craig share with you what SB 79 is and how this will roll out in some parts of Venice where we're pretty certain that the impacts will be. So Craig, I'm going to turn it back over to you for an educational session on SB 79.
Thank you, Councilwoman Park. If we could show the first slide. So I first want to disclose before we do the presentation on the first slide, we do have a disclosure. This legislation has been amended multiple times, about a dozen times since it was introduced. And so this is the legislation as we had it updated as of September 2nd of 2025. There could be additional modifications made to the legislation as it goes through. So I just wanted to disclose that before as we start this presentation. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So the SB 79 is operating on a 3-tier system, and each tier represents a mode of transportation. So the modes of transportation that will be impacted and that will impact Venice will be a tier 2. Tier 1 and Tier 3, there is none of that transportation, the heavy rail or the frequent commuter rail. So we'll just be focusing on Tier 2 tonight. So each of the tiers have a radius of a quarter and a half mile, and that is makes the determination of the type of density allowed. If we go to the next slide, please. So the areas that we worked with the Department of City Planning on and identifying the major transit corridor, the major transit stop in Venice is at Lincoln and Rose and at Lincoln and Venice. So as you can see from the slide presentation here, you see those darker bluish color with the lighter color. That is the quarter mile and half mile respectively of each of those major transit stops. And if you look into the color of the parcels that you see here that has been drawn from ZEMIS, you can see that this impacts our commercial corridor zoning, our multifamily zoning, and our single family zoning through the SB79 as far as where projects would be eligible. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So this is Lincoln and Venice closer up. And so we see the impacts here specifically, and it will impact those areas, as I said, immediately there. This is a known intersection with major transit corridor. It does affect all of the zones that I previously stated, but we wanted to do a zoom closing up. The star that you see represents a case study that we're going to see in the following slide. We can go to next slide, please. So we did a case study, and the case study was to kind of demonstrate how like SB9 works. For example, we picked this random property at 2009 South Oakwood Avenue. It is a R2 zoned property, and it has a lot size of 4,000 square feet, and it is located within a half mile of a Tier 2 stop. So looking at that, the density levels today, not including an accessory dwelling unit, would be 2 units allowed today. Under SB 79, it would be allowed to go up to 8 units. And then it would include the following income restricted units, either the 7% extremely low, 10% very low, or 13% low income. And that determination would be made by the applicant or developer who submits the project. One of the features of SB 79 is that you can do a density stack. And so you can take that 8 units that you were allowed by right and the SB 79 and go up to those 16 units. To get there, you would have to do the inclusion of following income restricted units of 15% of very low income and 15% of moderate income, or 24% low income and 15% moderate income, or 44% moderate income. So these are combinations, they're not or, they're and. And also because these projects are located in the proximity areas of the major transit stop, they will not be required to have parking in those projects. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this goes back to the comments made by Councilwoman Park about the efforts that were put in by this community through multiple meetings over a long period of time that was had with the planning department and neighborhood council and other community stakeholders about how we got to like our community plan update. This particular law actually, in essence, changes the zoning of these properties without really any community input. It takes an R1 lot, for example, and elevates that to R3 or higher levels, which is multifamily levels of residential development. Next slide, please. So since this is still in the legislature, it was passed by the Assembly Appropriations Committee on Friday, this past Friday, and we'll be going for a vote for the full Assembly before it goes back to the full Senate And then if it should pass both of those houses, it goes to the governor for signature to become law. We encourage you to contact your state elected representatives because they are the ones who will be voting on these bills coming up. The legislative session closes September 12th, so we encourage people to state their opinions earlier. The vote may happen before the 12th, but the 12th is the last day of the legislative session, and then from there it goes to the governor's office. And that concludes my presentation. I thank you very much.
Great. Can I add something real quick?
Yes, please
Thank you
do.
for that, Craig. Real quick, before we move on to questions, I have a couple. Can you go back to the affordability requirements? Because I want to point this out for folks. You know, the people who are pushing this bill are going to tell you that this is an effort to address our affordability crisis. But let's go back and look at the percentages of units, right? 7% extremely low income, 10% very low income. These are really small percentages or numbers of units that are actually going to be restricted as affordable housing. These are very, very small drops in the bucket. These are not all affordable housing projects. And they are typically, we waive the parking requirements sometimes on the affordable projects and around the transit zones. And so I just want to point that out, that this isn't really about affordability. And I also think, you know, sometimes there is a confusion about how these affordability requirements work. And so for those of you who may or may not know, and I don't have the exact amounts in front of me, but you know, for extremely low income, that is going to be a relatively low percentage of our area median income, which on the west side is actually pretty high. So you might have folks that are, you know, eligible for some of the moderate level income units. So for example, if you look at this scenario here where you end up with the 16 units and you have the option of doing 44% moderate income requirements, you may be looking at folks that are making 80, 90, $100,000 a year, which is great because we do need housing for that mid-market income, but it is not solving really where we're seeing the pinch point, which is at those lower percentages of AMI. And so what this does to get at the affordability crisis here is minimal at best. So I wanted to point that out. Craig, for folks who may not be familiar with the lingo here, can you talk just a little bit more about what California state density bonus law is and how that sort of provides a drop-down menu of developer enhancements for qualifying projects and how those are in addition to the additional density and other elements of SB79. Can you just walk us through that for those of us who are not as familiar with the terms and how that works?
Yes, I can certainly do that. So this will be
Thanks.
obviously overly simplistic, but essentially the density bonus program that has been passed by the state and codified by the city allows developers to construct more units than the zoning would otherwise allowed in exchange for income restricted units. And the income restricted units are similar to those percentages that you see in the affordability requirement in the chart here. And in addition to the developer providing those units, the program provides that applicant with waivers and incentives. And the waivers and incentives are used for making the project financially and physically feasible. And so we would do.
Explain what waivers and incentives mean. Waiver
Yes.
of what?
So I would
Incentive to do.
I was just about to. So
Okay.
so the waivers could be like, for instance, if you had a commercial design overlay, for example, and it required a ground floor commercial component, you could use the waiver of a development standard not to have that commercial space on the ground floor of a project. And other examples of waivers and incentives is the increase of floor area ratio, the increase of height, the decrease of open space, the decrease of setbacks. In this particular, parking would not be applicable because parking isn't a requirement of these particular projects with SB 79. But if you are not in an eligible project, should SB 79 pass, you could, use that towards further reduction of your parking. So it's the concept of the waivers and incentives are to make the project physically and financially feasible to construct. Well, we obtain affordable housing at an expense, at the developer's expense, that the city did not have to invest in.
And so here, since developers aren't required to do parking at all, they are likely to choose other incentives like setbacks,
Yeah,
reductions in green space, those other kinds of things. And so I wanted to point that out because oftentimes, as we think about development and adding new buildings and projects in the community, those oftentimes are some of the most important pieces for the community. And I also mention this because I worry about the no parking here in Venice. We have some of the most parking challenged terrain anywhere in the city. We have an inflow of tens of thousands of additional workers and visitors on a daily basis, on a regular basis, never mind high season with events and tourism. And so I have some real concerns. And again, whether you live in an apartment or a single family home, whether you rent or own, this will impact traffic and parking and strains on infrastructure. And that includes our roads, our schools, our sidewalks, our police department, our fire department, and everything else. And SB 79 does not come with an infusion of cash from Sacramento to upgrade our infrastructure to support that level of density. And in large part of the reason we have focused on our transit and commercial corridors through our community plans and CHIP and our housing element and other places is because that is where we can sustain those demands better. So I wanted to leave it at that. Thank you for those clarifications, Craig. Jeff, happy to take some questions out of the chat. Any pressing, burning questions there that we need to answer?
Yeah, I'm just going through the questions right now, but I just wanted to add really quick, what makes SB 79 really different and honestly unprecedented is that it doesn't just add on to the zoning rules that we have, because up until now, most of the housing laws we've dealt with in California have worked through density bonus, and it just adds an extra perk. The zoning sets the baseline of how tall or dense a building can be, and the law says if you provide affordable housing or meet certain requirements, you get to build a little more than the baseline allows. SB 79 flips that model. Instead of working off that baseline and adding a bonus, it actually changes the underlying zoning itself. And that means the starting point, the basic rules of what you can do and where you can go, gets rewritten by the state. In other words, it isn't just a bonus on top of local rules. It's the state saying, here's the new rule for the land use itself. And so that's why people are calling it unprecedented, because it represents a shift from local control to state local control with state granted exceptions to the state stepping in and directly redefining what zoning is in the first place. And so I just wanted to kind of mention that because we haven't seen anything like SB 79 before. And so there could be a lot of considerations that we have to make in terms of implementing it if it passes. And right now I'm going through the questions. And there's a question from anonymous person says, if we need more housing, why shouldn't it be near high quality transportation?
It should be near high quality transportation. And that is one of the places and ways that we have allocated density along our transit corridors. And our citywide housing incentive program doubles down on that as well. So that's already what we're doing. But these mandates and these areas tread into places that can create major public safety risks and infrastructure strains. And so that's where a lot of these concerns are coming from.
And this next question is more for Craig. It asks, can the team here speak on the trade-offs between affordability requirements for housing units and the number of units that get built?
Yes. So overly simplified, there's the basic formula, and then if a developer is seeking additional waivers and incentives beyond what is prescribed by density bonus, then they have to do the inclusion of additional affordable housing. And that is also built into our CHIP program, which also has affordable housing requirements in it, should you want to take advantage of those incentives to do that. I mean, CHIP is actually incentivized in some areas at higher levels than the state density bonus law, so it can yield actually higher amounts of housing and affordable housing by using that process rather than the state density bonus.
Thanks, Craig. There's a question here about the BRT on Lincoln, because it's just a proposed idea. It's planned, right? It's not there today. And the estimate completion date is likely not for another, this person says 30 years, but we know it's probably going to come next couple of years. Why is there?
They're working on it now. So that's a really good question. Is this actual existing transit, or is this proposed someday down the road transit?
So for SB79, it looks at transit stations that have been approved and adopted either by council or a legislator. In this case, because the Lincoln BRT is planned and has already been adopted, that's why it's being counted as a TOD stop. We have a question here. We have 6 parking spots for every housing unit in Los Angeles County. We have more cars than people. When will we have enough parking? Well,
yeah, I don't know if those numbers are accurate or not. I
right.
can tell you over here, we do have a lot of cars, and parking is a challenge constantly. I also don't, I don't foresee a world where people are giving up their cars and just en masse moving over to transit. And I'll tell you why. Look at West LA Sawtelle. This has been the test case for this for the last 2 decades. And over the last 10 years in particular, we saw entire city blocks of historic neighborhoods wiped out for metro and other large developments. We've seen a huge addition of density in that neighborhood, a lot of it with reduced or relaxed parking requirements. And I'm not criticizing the production of the housing. I am criticizing here the reduction in the parking requirements. I used to think that Venice was the most parking challenged part of CD11. That is absolutely 100% not true. That is Sawtelle, West LA. And despite all of that new housing that went in near transit, because the assumption is people who live near transit are going to use transit, they're not giving up their cars to do it. And so I just am not buying the argument that all of a sudden this new density means people are giving up their cars, or new transit lines or bus rapid lanes. I just don't foresee that happening. And I want us to think it through. And again, we're not saying no to the housing. I mean, we have literally worked through in hundreds of hours worth of meetings where and how we think we can put it to mitigate parking and traffic challenges. But to back multiple 6, 7-story buildings back to back to back to back in very, very dense communities with substandard roads and limited options, I think we are going to see major issues from that. So, you know, if SB79 passes, obviously those are the challenges that we will have to turn to, is what the heck we are going to do to try to address those. But I, 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 I don't see the cars going away.
We do have a question here about the Coastal Act. Most housing laws that come in have a clause that specifies harmonizing with the Coastal Act and creates carve-outs or exemptions for the coastal zone. This question is asking whether our office is going to approach the legislator to advocate for this coastal carve-out.
Yes, and it's a really fair point. There is none for coastal zone. There is none for very high fire severity zones, FEMA mandated flood zones. There are no exceptions. There is absolutely no regard given to what the actual circumstances on the ground are. And so that, again, is one of the big concerns here. So yes, I would advocate for that. And I would advocate for that in our very high fire severity zones and probably some other places as well.
Fortunately, the high fire severity zones was added in the latest amendment that happened like last week. So we just got that this week. So
okay, well that helps.
Has been added. Yeah. So
And it would, I should also note, it would be helpful for residents to be advocating for the inclusion or the modifications to the legislation or your opposition. I mean, we can't effectively do this all the time, and elected officials need to hear from their constituents, and these elected officials in the state are your representatives. You should make your views known.
The next question talks about how do we make our voices heard. And so if we can go back to that slide with the contact information of the state legislators, that'd be great. And also the governor as well, because he's going to be the one that eventually signs the bill if it passes both houses.
All right. Was that it on the questions, Jeff?
Looks like it.
All right. I can't believe it. We might actually end a webinar on pretty close to on time. That will be a first. All righty, guys. Well, we intended to keep this short. We just wanted to use this as an opportunity to educate you about what is in the pipeline. I wanted to share my concerns. You know, I have always been very, very transparent about my belief that the people who live in and invest in their communities are the ones who know it best and deserve a seat at the table in designing what your future will look like and will be. And these one size fits all state mandates from people who have never been to your neighborhood, unfortunately, make it very, very difficult for us to have the flexibility that we need to do local planning in a way that is safe and smart and responsible, is mindful of public safety and the infrastructure capacity that we have to support it. So whether you support SB79 or not, we wanted to make you aware of it and give you an opportunity to learn how you can make your voices heard. So thank you for your interest, for being here this evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you all out in Venice over the weekend. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.